Alright, so today we're going to be talking about how to use tempera paint and how to do your portrait for your character design. Okay? So I want you to start off with a nice shaded drawing. You remember one of the points of emphasis on this assignment is that you show form, right? Most of you, if you've been working, doing an adequate job, you should be able to shade something fairly well and provide some base level illusion of form with your shading, all right, when you draw. Now, our goal here today is to, instead of taking all of your drawing knowledge and skills and throwing them out the window, to use them to help you paint better, okay? So you have to do this in a really specific way. I have spent a lot of time making my nice drawing, trying to make it as good as I can, and I don't want to lose that by painting thick paint over the whole thing. So the key, what we're doing today, is to use thin layers of paint, all right? We're going to start off with this paint. We're going to try to use it like a watercolor, and we're going to slowly build it up. Once we get into the final stages, we can start making it thick, but for now, we want to keep it really thin so that we can see the drawing underneath, okay? The tempera paint comes in two forms. We've got these cakes, all right? We've got liquid. It's in bottles, all right? You can use either of them. You can use them both together. I'm going to use the cakes because the cakes have a brown, which is convenient for me. They also have kind of a peach color, which is convenient for me today. So I'm going to be using the cakes to start out with. I'll probably use the bottled stuff as I go through. All right, so this is going to work just like the watercolor cakes. You're going to take a little bit of water and you're going to put it on here. I'm going to actually move it to my palette so I can kind of see how thick it is here. So like I said before, I want my paint to be thin, so let's take a look. So you can see, I can see my drawing through my paint still, all right? So I want to lay this on in transparent layers so that I can see through them. I'm going to start with my local color. The local color is like the color that the surface I'm painting is, the color that we would describe it as, all right? So in this situation, it would be brown. So let's talk a little bit about local colors, highlights, and shadows. So your local color, like we said, is going to be the color that the thing is. We're also going to be trying to think about highlights and shadows, right? So highlights and shadows tend to have temperatures. We've talked about temperature before. So light tends to be either sort of warm or cool, depending on the light source. So if we look at the light around here, it's kind of warm. If you look at the light bulbs, they have a little bit of a kind of yellow tone to them, okay? The light outside that comes in through the windows when we turn the lights off tends to be a little bit cooler. The same thing is true of shadows. They can either have a warm tinge or a cool tinge to them. And it'll usually be opposite the sort of temperature of the light. So if we have a warm light, we'll usually have a cool shadow and vice versa. So we want to kind of keep that in mind when we're shading in color. That our lights and shadows are going to have a temperature to them. It's not necessarily critical that we get the right color for our light and shadow, or that we get it perfect, but if we can keep the temperature in mind and kind of get the temperature correct, we can usually get away with a little bit of error on the specifics of the color. All right. So you can see I've applied most of my local brown here, and I still can see my drawing. So that's our goal here. Did I hear someone's phone going? It'd be a shame if I had to take away a phone. That's really not being present or polite. All right. See what we did there? All right, let's talk about maybe I'll put some brown up in the nest too. Might as well do that now. Probably going to add some other colors to this, kind of differentiate it from my character here. But I can start with the base. So the cool thing about tempera is that I can make it really thin. I can also make it thicker. So it has a lot of versatility to it. And I can take advantage of this, like I said earlier, by building it up slowly. So I'm going to start to add some shadow to this. So for my shadow, I'm going to squeeze out a little bit of blue paint into my palette. And I only need a little bit at a time. See, just a little dab. Okay? Just a little bit at a time. You don't need a lot of paint. Oh. Probably actually use this. See that crusty chunk that fell off? One of the other cool things about the tempera paint is that it's water soluble. So I can actually put a little bit of water on that, and I can turn it right back into paint. I'll let that sit. So I'm going to mix in with my brown, I'm going to mix in a little bit of blue and a little bit of red, and that should create sort of a purplish tinge to my brown. Okay? So then I'm going to use that sort of color to do my shadows that are on my brown bear fur. All right. If I have something that's kind of reflective, I'm probably going to want to keep a highlight, which is going to mean I'm going to have some white. I can add some white paint to it later. But for the fur, I probably don't need to worry about that a whole lot. So next I'm going to take some of my peach here, start adding some water to that. And move it onto my palette. I'm going to add a little bit of yellow. So I think this guy's hanging out in the woods, right? So he's going to be a little bit sunburned. Add a little yellow, some red to my skin tone here. Did done warn you over there. I barely took some time out to warn you that I was having previous problems and I wanted them to stop. Remember, you guys, I'm trying to foster an environment of mutual respect. That cannot happen if I'm the only one being respectful. It's not mutual respect. Alright, so I'm trying to get kind of an orangey skin tone to this. I'm going to test a little bit. Yep, and still see through. Good. Let's start applying that. So you can see I'm really keeping a lot of my drawing as I paint on here. And I can continue to build this up until I don't see any more drawing. Just use that drawing as kind of a blueprint for where things go. Or I can keep it like pretty washy and not necessarily go super thick on the paint. And that way will work as well. Just kind of an aesthetic choice. But if I build it up slowly, even if I don't see my drawing at the end, I can continue to paint on my drawing and put the paint where I had originally planned for it to go. I'm going to add a little more kind of orange or red to it. A little bit of sunburn. Think about the surfaces that are kind of facing more upward. Should not mumble to myself. I'm also going to make some shadow. So for that, I'll take my skin tone I've been working with here. Again, I'm going to add a little blue to cool it off. Lower the value a little bit. I don't want it to be super blue like that. right? So I want to desaturate it a little bit. So the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to mix in some complementary colors. So that's going to mean some orange. So that's going to mean some red and yellow. So I get kind of a gray tone. Maybe a little more of that skin tone. So I don't need the shadows to be too crazy. So something like that. It's pretty good. Here, the eyes. Set the nose here. Okay. So that's the idea there. I'm going to make a little bit of pink for the ears. I've got this skin tone, so I'm going to start with that. Add a little more red to that. If my colors start to get too muddy, I can clean up my brush or I can switch to a different one. Oh, you can see that's really thick. So I just kind of keep moving it around. And if I need to, I can take a little water and put it on my brush, and I can add a little water to it. So if your painting starts to get too wet, you don't want it to have sitting water on top of it. You want the water and the paint to go into the paper. So I can kind of dab that off and pull some of it off with my paper towel. Conversely, if my colors are starting to pollute my paint, I can clean my brush off. The best way to clean your brush is to get it wet and then wipe it on your paper towel. Okay? If you just get it wet, it's probably not going to get clean, and your brush is also probably going to be too wet, and it's going to start making messes. So you don't necessarily just want to get the brush wet. So one of the things I'm looking for in this painting is that you paint all of the surfaces of your paper. So that means even in the areas that I want to be white when I'm done, I'm going to paint them still. Okay. So I'm going to paint this beard here. Again, I'm keeping it thin so that I can see my drawing through. I'm building up the paint slowly. I may need to clean off the center of my palette here. I should do that. This beard's probably a little dirty. So I can clean the center of my palette if I need to. That didn't take long, did it? Just wipe it out with a paper towel. Whoa. A little more on there than perhaps I wanted. So while I've got my white here, creepy white eyes. While I've got my white here, I can also apply some highlights. If I want to apply like some highlights to my fur, I can do that. I kind of want to think like about fur, right? So maybe we want kind of a furry texture while we're applying the highlights. So we kind of want to think about fur while we're putting the white on. And when I actually start coming in and going for my second layer, I can apply the paint a little more thickly. Something like that, right? Here, right? So I can start to apply highlights like that. Maybe I get into these wrinkles and I start thinking about where each of these surfaces is going to be hit most directly by the light, so kind of top and left side. Okay. And also, don't forget background, all right? So in the assignment, it doesn't specify on this one what kind of background you need to do, but I do want your paper to be painted, not white paper. Like I said, I want the entirety of your paper to be painted, so at least get in there and lay some kind of color in. It's okay if we mess up this border a little bit. We can come back in and clean it up later by building up paint on top. Gonna kind of actually work into the bear a little bit because I don't want to leave any white paper. What we can actually do is, this is kind of cool maybe. Mix our paint. Not quite yet. So we'll lay some paint in here. Thin that out. Oh man, yeah, thin that out. So we'll just get the border, keep that later, where we're coming up against the subject here. And then we can come back in with water and just start pulling out from there without even adding any new paint. Then we get kind of a little bit of action happening in the background here. Especially when you're doing the background or whatever, I recommend rotating your painting just to make it easier to get to the areas you're trying to work on. Too wet. So you want to be careful about getting it too wet. When it gets too wet, you're going to lose control of the paint. It's just going to go where it wants to go. So again, you want to put on just enough water, just enough paint so that it goes into the paper, not so much that it pools on the surface. Okay. And then we can kind of continue to build. So mix kind of a shadow color. Mix that by mixing all of my primaries. I've got some blue, some red, some yellow. That usually tends to be a little more interesting than if you just use black. Pull that in. Small brush for this part, right? Just get some of the sort of deepest shadows here. So at this point, once I've got kind of a coat on, I'm starting to work it. What I'm really going to start to do is push and pull contrast. So the contrast is the difference between the lights and the darks on here. And I want to find a nice balance where I've got a contrast between my light and dark that looks kind of interesting and pleasing. Okay. Another thing I can do with this is I can start to kind of deepen the texture a little bit. So if I kind of work on here and I think about this idea of fur and what the fur is going to feel like, how the fur is going to move, and I move my brush in the same way, I can apply shadow, but I can also apply texture at the same time here. If you haven't gotten your own brushes and brought them in, it's probably about time to do that. All right, does anybody have any questions? Okay, so that's how you use the tempera, basically. And you can continue to build this up. Like, I could build it up a lot more than this until I get to the point where I'm using full, thick tempera. But you want to start with the thin layers and build it up real slowly. Okay? All right. There is watercolor paper up on this top or front table.